This is Hope Matters, a production of Mount Olive Lutheran Church here in Santa Monica, California. I'm Pastor Eric Shafer, the senior pastor here at Mount Olive. And each week on Hope Matters, we talk to an interesting person from around the community, around the nation, even around the world about the theme of hope, because we believe that hope matters. My guest today is Pastor Peter Nycklemoe, who is the senior pastor at Central Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Welcome, Peter. Glad you could join us today.
Oh, this is a great privilege. Thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed the podcast, and they've been very uplifting, hopeful through this weird pandemic that we still find ourselves in. So thank you for your ministry and your work. Yeah.
Now, our viewers in Minnesota know about Central Lutheran Church, but probably most of our viewers don't know much about your congregation. It has a really interesting history. It's a large urban congregation. So tell our viewers a little bit about Central Lutheran Church and some of its key ministries.
Yeah. So the short story is the congregation now is 100 years old. So it was founded in 1919 by Pastor Stube. Old ALC folks know that name well. Maybe some former LCA folks know that. And when it was built, the sanctuary was completed in 1926. It was probably, I don't know historically, but maybe one of the last neo-Gothic Lutheran cathedrals built in North America. We don't build churches like that anymore. And it was started with the intentionality of being an English-speaking congregation in the midst of all the immigrant waves that were still happening, and this big migration that we know of people moving from rural and small town America into larger metropolitan areas, which we've all experienced all over the country. And so that was Central's mission. And by the 30s into the 40s, the congregation was worshiping 5 to 6 and then 7,000, 8,000 people. In fact, when they got after the war in the 50s, there were times that the cathedral seats about 2,000. On Easter, they had to rent the armory for Easter worship because they needed space for 10,000 people. So some people say it was sort of one of even the first Lutheran mega churches. And that really shaped its consciousness. And as you know well, Central also had a very early radio ministry that broadcast all over the Midwest. So we've heard stories of North Dakota farmers in their barn, listening to Central. And then when their kids grew up and came to Minneapolis, naturally, that's where they came and engaged, particularly as single folks, and that kind of expansiveness. The significant change for Central happened in the 60s when we had the interstate system come through most urban areas, and it dissected Central's historic neighborhood. And also, as we all know, that created the possibility of urban sprawl, and the suburbs and rings, and in Minneapolis then gave birth to really remarkable congregations out in the suburbs that have become significant congregations. It changed Central's course from this large kind of organic worshiping center to a smaller worshiping community, now in an urban core that was going through radical changes. And we all know, many of us, in urban cores, what happened in the 70s and in the 80s. You had urban blight and a lot of challenges. And the members of Central were so committed to the neighborhood, they formed what was called the Restoration Center 50 years ago to start to meet the needs of the people who were on their doorstep. And for 50 years, they've been a very deep engagement with caring for folks who are experiencing homelessness, helping folks move out of homelessness, a Monday worship service, a Monday community meal, a free store like a Goodwill that runs Monday through Thursday, and partnering with Augsburg University for a health commons, because what I've learned in the 7 years here is that one of the number one issues for people experiencing homelessness is foot care, especially in Minnesota, frostbite. So we have these first-year nursing students under the guidance of their faculty come, and the first thing they're doing is foot washing, which sounds very familiar to us.
It does.
So we always joke about the fact that on Saturday and Sunday when we gather for worship, we are in that word and sacrament life, rooted mostly in the synoptics, but Monday through Thursday, we're in John's gospel and doing foot washing, and that ministry continues. And it's given birth to advocating groups. We have a Street Voices of Change group of people who have experienced homelessness, who are now housed, who are now leaders in our community for working to change legislation about shelter bill of rights, access to affordable housing. So it's just been this organic movement. And we continue to struggle with the racial divide, in our life. And often our congregations on Sunday morning are very white as Lutherans. And then our experience Monday through Thursday is our congregation is mostly people of color. And so now we have this incredible opportunity to find the way, how do we build the bridges, and how do we start to understand one another and move to a different understanding of justice that leads to peace, for all people. And there's a tremendous challenge for a congregation like Central, downtown, large facility. So what we did then is a number of years ago, we had 75,000 square feet of old Sunday school space from the 50s, you can envision that, the old parlors, all that. And we had a huge liability. It was going to cost the congregation tens of millions of dollars to renovate that. So the congregation voted and did this bold decision. We tore that all down. And for 13 months, all we had was the sanctuary and porta potties outside for the congregation. And one of my favorite moments is I had to go back to my car to get something, and I was coming back into the sanctuary, and one of our 9-year-olds came bursting out of the porta potty with their walker in February and said, "Boy, that is really cold on the rear end."
At least it said rear end.
Yeah, exactly. But the power of that, which I learned from the congregation, is in that time, the congregation had this huge shift to adaptation. And when we entered the pandemic, member after member and member of the community, whether it's Sunday community or Wednesday community, have said that taught us about adaptation. And to your remarkable theme that's running, I think one of the core essentials for hope is the ability to adapt. The ability to remember that we have been through this in some way before, and that God was there, God is with us, and God's going to move us forward. Because if hope is just a future thing that we can't imagine, we're not going to have the muscle memory to live into that hope. And what Central experienced, both in the radical change of their neighborhood and how they had to pivot in ministry, rather than being a huge destination church to being more an organic neighborhood church rooted in the core of downtown Minneapolis, as well as tearing the building down and re-envisioning their future, they had to learn this. Or as we often talked about, one of our great leaders said, we're kind of going through congregational Pilates right now.
How true, how true.
And I've heard that kind of woven through some of your great podcasts, that a lot of people have talked about in this pandemic, that the living into the hope that God gives to us is also tied to needing to be a lot more flexible, a lot more adaptive. And it's not our outcome that we want. It's really what's God's outcome. What is God inviting us into, if that kind of makes sense to you? Oh,
yeah. Well, you've been doing, broadcast ministry and others for years. But as you know, overnight, 90% of our congregations had to pivot into doing something they'd never done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know how it may not have affected your congregation as much as it affected our congregation, but all of a sudden we have a reach that's continued and hasn't dropped off beyond anything they could have ever imagined here.
Yeah, it's stunning. So part of a building program, when we did that, we had the team that said, we need to put in digital cameras, upgrade our internet, our sound, all that stuff in this beautiful sanctuary, because we have these stunning visuals. I mean, you've been to Central so many times, the beauty of the space. So we put it all in. We hired staff that could do that all before the pandemic. The pandemic hit. So it was an easy pivot for us because we had already moved to a very, really significant online ministry opportunity. And it's exactly as you said, our online numbers, of course, skyrocketed and have stayed up there. And we hear from people in Portland and, in Africa and in Europe who say, oh, it's been great to be at Central. And now what we're hearing is folks are saying, well, I'm happy I can be back at my congregation, in Arizona or in Pennsylvania or Florida, but it's still fun to drop in on Central on occasion. So I'm worshiping with you, but I still go to my congregation because I need local indigenous community as well. And we're like, whatever you need, this is remarkable.
Yeah, and it's, that's a whole other conversation, but how it's redefined what a congregation is.
Yeah.
Because you probably had the same phenomenon we did here. We had people who moved away either for a while or permanently, but want to maintain a relation with us, and because of digital can.
Yeah.
And there are some pastors that say, oh, that's wrong. And I'm saying, huh?
No. It's brilliant. And our snowbirds, we've got those folks.
Yes.
They're loving this. They were like, we've been wanting this for 10 years because we love to have our congregation in Florida or Arizona and that community, but we really miss Central. And of course, what they really love is they say, we love it when they pan the congregation because we can say, oh, there's Bob and there's Mary and there's Joe.
Well, things we weren't trained for in seminary, Peter.
No, not at all. We couldn't even have imagined this.
No, but that's where you pivot and are creative. You know, Peter, I looked at your career and you've done urban ministry, you've done suburban ministry, you've cleaned up other people's messes as a pastor, you've done a whole. So what sticks out for you over the course of what, 4 or 5 congregations you've served? What
Yep.
sticks out for you as most memorable? And that could be good or bad, I guess.
I think the constant theme for me is the absolute resilience of congregations. I think the core of a congregation and that community is they want to be healthy. They want to be vibrant. They want to live their faith into the community, care for the vulnerable and the poor and the marginalized. And so many things get in the way of that. And when we contend that, there's sort of always that muscle memory in the body of Christ to come back to the core things that we're called to do. And you're right, like you, when I've been called in to serve after very complicated things and sad and frustrating things for people, once they kind of move through that emotional process, it's amazing how quickly they come back to the core of what they want to do. One of my mentors always said, that when congregations experience trauma or the world is complicated or all the forces kind of push in on us, we turn our toes inward again. And what we need to do is get our toes pointing out again. And once that happens, things kind of start to come back online. And as in your interviews, one of the themes you're hearing is, there's a lot of concern in the future, whether it's pandemic, the questions about racial justice that is here, the economic issues that we're facing, the change for the old historic Constantinian church that's gone, in our culture that we live in. So we can focus on that and fall apart, or how do we come back to our muscle memory again and say, we have such good news, and there is a hope that calls us forward. So how do we remember who we are so that we have a sense of that movement into the future? And
that's great.
As we were talking about, we knew George Floyd well. He was a part of this faith community, and a very gentle giant is a good description of who he was. And then that tragic murder, that happened and has stunned all of us. And Central's been engaged in that, and our community has wrestled with that. But it starts also in the fact that we know one another. We have relationships here, and this can happen in all of our communities. And particularly we who are white folks with a significant amount of power and privilege, have to be in that journey of awareness, naming those things, and deep abiding listening, which is also part of our heritage, in our contemplative life. In the deep life of prayer, that we have an awareness that we can step back and become deep listeners. And so through that experience too, we really spent a significant amount of time listening to the voices in our community and their stories, and how that has continued to transform us and open us and tend to the things that we need to tend to.
Thank you. Well, Peter, I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk with us. There's so much more we could talk about.
Yeah.
As I told you before we began, I try to keep these fairly short so that people can have a dose of hope in the morning or evening or wherever they need it. And so maybe we should talk again. I would love to do that. So,
well, like we said, you know my dad forever. You've known Central. And a lot of your listeners know that when Lutherans get together, it sometimes can be a little bit old home week or feel that way. But I still think of it like a small town, that we have these connections and relationships, and it's such a gift. So like I said at the opening, I'm grateful for you in this ministry, because I've really been blessed by your podcast, and it's been so hopeful for me. So thank you for your ministry too, Eric. Just really remarkable.
Thank you, Peter. I so appreciate this.
That,
This has been Hope Matters, a production of Mount Olive Lutheran Church here in Santa Monica, California. Each week we talk to an interesting person around the community, around the world. Today our guest has been Pastor Peter Nycklemoe, the senior pastor at Central Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you for being with us, Peter. We're so grateful today.
you're welcome. Thank you.
Tune in again next week when we talk to another interesting person, because we believe that hope matters, and we believe in a God of hope.